My own daughter called the police on me for financial fraud at 2 in the morning. She stood behind a wall of armed officers pretending to sob into her hands. At the station, they shoved me into a freezing interrogation room expecting a confused old man to confess. 30 minutes later, a senior executive walked in, looked at me and said, "Welcome back, my friend." The entire precinct froze. My name is Vincent Blackwood, and I am 68 years old. Before I tell you how a simple arrest unleashed the full weight of a multi-billion-dollar corporate apparatus against my greedy family, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly destroy the people who underestimated your worth. The flashing red and blue lights did not wake me. It was the violent, splintering crack of my solid mahogany front door, giving way under the force of a police battering ram. I stood at the top of my staircase, quietly cinching the belt of my robe, watching as 3 armed officers surged onto the landing. Their heavy boots trampled over the hardwood floors I had installed with my own hands decades ago. Flashlights cut through the darkness of my home, sweeping over the framed photographs of a family that as of tonight no longer existed. I did not shout. I did not raise my hands in sudden panic. Decades of navigating hostile corporate takeovers had trained my nervous system to process absolute chaos with terrifying stillness. I analyzed their tactical entry, the spacing between the officers and the steady grip of the lead detective stepping onto my oriental rug, and then I saw her. My daughter Amanda. She was cowering behind the broad shoulders of the lead officer, clutching her expensive silk dressing gown tight against her chest. Her shoulders heaved with violent theatrical sobs. She buried her face into the chest of her husband Cameron, who stood wrapping a fiercely protective arm around her trembling frame. "He does not know what he is doing," Amanda cried out, her voice echoing up the staircase with perfect manufactured despair. Her finger shaking flawlessly on cue, pointed directly up at me. "The dementia has made him aggressive. He is losing his mind. He stole my identity. He took out credit cards in my name and drained our entire life savings into offshore accounts." She buried her face back into Cameron's shoulder, weeping uncontrollably. It was a masterpiece of a performance. The lead officer, a thick-set man with a deeply sympathetic look aimed at my daughter, stepped forward and held up a sheaf of freshly printed papers. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his tone carrying that specific mix of authority and gentle condescension reserved for the elderly. "We received a distressed call regarding severe financial fraud and erratic behavior. We have bank statements here showing $250,000 wired from your daughter's accounts to offshore routing numbers, all initiated from your personal computer." I looked down at the papers clutched in his hand. Even from the top of the stairs, my eyesight was sharp enough to catch the bold black ink of the routing numbers printed across the top sheet. My pulse remained completely steady, but my mind snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. I recognized those numbers instantly. They were not Amanda's personal checking accounts. They were heavily encrypted offshore holding accounts specifically structured for international corporate acquisitions. There was only one way those exact routing numbers could have been printed on a document inside this house. Cameron had planted them in my basement study. The realization did not break me. It illuminated the entire battlefield with absolute clarity. My son-in-law was a failing tech entrepreneur, drowning in massive debt, and my daughter had grown tired of waiting for her inheritance. They had manufactured a digital trail of massive theft and tied it directly to my home network. The lead officer placed his hand heavily on the wooden railing, taking another step up the stairs. "Vincent Blackwood, you are under arrest for felony wire fraud and elder-related identity theft. Put your hands behind your back." I did not waste my breath defending myself to uniformed officers acting on forged evidence. Arguing with a loaded weapon is the tactic of a desperate man, and I was anything but desperate. I slowly descended the stairs, step by step, the wood creaking softly under my weight. I stopped on the final step and calmly extended my wrists. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit deeply into my skin. The sharp click of the locking mechanism echoed in the foyer, sealing the trap my family had laid for me. As the officer tightened the metal around my wrists, I did not look at him. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Cameron. I watched the tension leave his shoulders. I caught the micro-expression of profound relief and arrogant triumph that flashed across his face for a fraction of a second before he remembered to look somber. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully neutralized a senile 68-year-old retired machinist who was simply too confused to understand digital finance. "Please," Officer Amanda begged loudly, her voice cracking with calculated misery. "Please be gentle with him. He is a sick man. He needs medical help, not a prison cell. He does not even know who he is anymore." Her performance was impeccable, painting me as a dangerous liability to myself and to society. She was establishing a solid medical narrative right in front of the police, ensuring that my silence would not be interpreted as the calculation of a lucid man, but as the pathetic confusion of a broken mind. The officers nodded sympathetically at her completely buying into the tragic scene of a loving daughter forced to institutionalize her own father for his own good. I remained perfectly silent. I let them believe the narrative. Silence is a weapon that the arrogant consistently mistake for weakness. As they patted me down and read me my Miranda rights, I mapped out the entire financial architecture of Cameron's failing startup in my head. I knew his investors. I knew his creditors. And most importantly, I knew the power of the corporate infrastructure I had kept hidden from them for 10 years. The officers gripped my arms and led me out the shattered front door into the freezing night air. The flashing lights of the cruisers illuminated the manicured lawns of my quiet suburban neighborhood. Porch lights flicked on one by one. Neighbors I had known for 20 years stood in their doorways, pulling their robes tight against the cold, watching in shocked silence as the quiet, respectable Vincent Blackwood was marched down his own driveway in handcuffs. The humiliation was designed to be absolute, an essential part of Amanda and Cameron's strategy to permanently discredit my reputation in the community. Just before the officer pushed my head down to guide me into the back of the police cruiser, Cameron stepped off the porch and hurried across the damp grass. He raised a hand, asking the officer for a brief moment to comfort his distressed father-in-law. The officer, moved by the display of family devotion, stepped back and allowed it. Cameron leaned in close, wrapping his arms around my shoulders in a fake, comforting embrace that looked perfectly supportive to the watching neighbors. His mouth hovered mere inches from my ear, and the facade of the worried son-in-law vanished instantly. His voice dropped to a cold, venomous whisper. "A judge signed an emergency conservatorship at midnight, Vincent. You are not coming back to this house. You are going from the precinct holding cell straight to a state-run locked psychiatric ward. We have the power of attorney. We have the house. Enjoy your new room." He pulled back his face instantly, transforming back into a mask of deep sorrow for the benefit of the police. He patted my chest gently, stepping away as the officer guided me into the hard plastic seat of the cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing me in the dark. The engine roared to life and the cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving my home behind. I sat in the darkness of the back seat, the streetlights flashing rhythmically across my face. Cameron's whisper echoed in my mind. A ticking clock had just been activated. An emergency conservatorship meant they had legal authority over my physical autonomy. They were going to chemically sedate me and lock me away before the sun came up, using the stolen money to finalize the immediate theft of my estate. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air of the cruiser fill my lungs. They had orchestrated a brilliant tactical strike against a helpless old man. Their only mistake was that the helpless old man did not exist. I leaned my head back against the thick glass, watching the neighborhood disappear into the night, waiting for the real game to begin at the precinct. The interrogation room was a concrete icebox designed to break human resolve through pure physical discomfort. The air conditioning hummed with a relentless mechanical rattle, blowing a steady stream of frigid air directly down the back of my neck. I sat in a rigid metal chair that offered no support, my wrists aching slightly where the cold steel cuffs bit into my skin. There was no clock on the pale gray walls, no window to the outside world, just a heavy steel door and a mirrored glass pane that reflected my own calm expression back at me. I did not shiver. I did not rub my wrists or pace the small perimeter of the room. Decades spent navigating brutal corporate boardrooms had taught me that the first person to show discomfort loses the negotiation before a single word is spoken. The heavy steel door swung inward with a sharp metallic clank, breaking the suffocating silence. A lead detective stepped into the room. He was a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and a permanently set jaw, carrying a thick manila folder that he dropped onto the center of the aluminum table with a loud, calculated slap. The sound was meant to startle me, to assert dominance and establish the hierarchy of the room. I did not flinch. I merely blinked, keeping my posture entirely relaxed, my breathing steady and measured. The detective pulled out the chair opposite mine and sat down heavily, leaning forward, invading my physical space. He introduced himself in a low, gravelly voice, skipping the usual pleasantries and diving straight into the practiced routine of a man used to extracting confessions from terrified suspects. He told me that my daughter was in the lobby crying her eyes out, devastated by the betrayal of her own father. He paused, waiting for me to take the bait, waiting for me to launch into a desperate, panicked defense of my character. When I offered nothing but silence, his jaw tightened. He flipped open the manila folder and slid a stack of freshly printed bank statements across the table. They stopped exactly an inch from my handcuffed wrists. The detective tapped his thick index finger against the top page directly beneath a highlighted line of transactions. He demanded to know why a 68-year-old retired man was routing exactly $250,000 into a sequence of heavily encrypted offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. He leaned back, crossing his arms, and informed me that wire fraud across international lines carrying stolen funds was a federal offense. He listed the penalties with brutal precision, painting a bleak picture of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I looked down at the documents. My face remained a mask of polite indifference, but my mind was working at lightning speed, analyzing every digit, every date, every timestamp printed on those pages. I recognized the routing sequence immediately. Cameron had made a fatal error in his desperation. He had gained access to my home study and fabricated a digital paper trail, thinking he could bury his own catastrophic debts by framing his father-in-law. But Cameron was a failing tech entrepreneur with a sloppy understanding of high-level financial architecture. He had pulled routing numbers from an old piece of mail he must have dug out of my trash. He assumed those numbers were tied to a vulnerable personal checking account. He had no idea he had just forged documents linking directly to the corporate umbrella of a multi-billion-dollar holding company. The detective slapped the table again, his voice rising in volume and aggression. He told me that my silence was not helping my case. He said he had seen men like me before, old men, who thought they could outsmart the digital age and hide money from their own families. He demanded I tell him where the access keys were, promising to speak to the district attorney about a plea deal if I cooperated immediately. I kept my mouth shut. I knew the rules of this game intimately. Speaking without legal representation was a trap designed to capture contradictions. Furthermore, engaging with this detective would validate his authority, and I had no intention of participating in a narrative written by my son-in-law. My silence infuriated him. The detective stood up, pacing the short length of the room, his boots scuffing aggressively against the linoleum floor. He threw his hands in the air, his frustration boiling over as he mocked my stoicism, asking if I was too confused to understand the severity of my situation. When intimidation failed to produce a confession, the detective stopped pacing. He returned to the table, his expression shifting from aggressive anger to a cold, calculated smirk. He reached into his jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a secondary document folded neatly in thirds. He smoothed it out on the table, keeping his hand firmly pressed against the top edge. He lowered his voice, dropping the aggressive interrogator persona and adopting a tone of mocking pity. He told me that the wire fraud was only half of my problem. He said he had spoken to Amanda and Cameron at length before entering this room. They had presented him with a tragic story of a father rapidly losing his grip on reality. The detective slid the folded document toward me. It was a medical affidavit. The letterhead belonged to a highly exclusive private clinic on the north side of the city. I scanned the crisp black text, my eyes locking onto the signature at the bottom. The document certified that I had been subjected to extensive cognitive evaluations over the past 6 months. The diagnosis was explicitly detailed, claiming I suffered from severe advanced cognitive detachment, prone to erratic behavior, memory loss, and sudden violent outbursts. The doctor had legally sworn under penalty of perjury that I was an immediate danger to myself and my family, completely incapable of managing my own finances or physical autonomy. A cold realization washed over me, far more chilling than the temperature of the room. This was not a simple frame job for financial theft. This was a meticulously planned, comprehensive erasure of my legal personhood. Cameron had not just forged bank statements. He had purchased a corrupt medical professional. He had bought a diagnosis to justify the emergency conservatorship they had pushed through a midnight judge. The true depth of my daughter's betrayal lay bare on that single sheet of paper. Amanda had authorized this. She had stood by while her husband bought a doctor to officially declare her father legally incompetent. The 20-year federal sentence the detective had threatened me with was a distraction. The police were never going to send me to a federal prison. The criminal charges were merely a mechanism to hold me in custody until the sun came up. Once the morning shift arrived, I would not be transferred to a county jail. I would be remanded directly into the custody of a state-run locked psychiatric facility, stripped of my rights, my voice, and my freedom. The detective leaned over the table, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of bitter coffee. He tapped the medical affidavit. He told me I was not going to a cell. He told me I was going to a ward. He smiled, a cruel, satisfied expression, believing he had finally broken the quiet, stubborn old man. I looked away from the forged medical document and met the detective's gaze. I did not blink. I did not show an ounce of the fear he expected to see. The walls of the trap had closed in, entirely sealing me inside a manufactured reality where I had no voice and no rights. The tension in the small room reached an absolute peak, the air growing thick and heavy. The detective waited for my panic, waited for the inevitable breakdown of a man realizing his life was over. Instead, I simply sat back in my chair, the metal handcuffs clinking softly against the table, and waited for the door to open. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unbroken. The detective's confident smirk began to waver, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Suspects facing decades behind bars or permanent institutionalization always reacted. They cried, they screamed, they begged for mercy or lashed out in desperate fury. They never simply sat still watching their interrogator with the detached curiosity of a predator observing a trap it had already figured out how to dismantle. I focused on the rhythmic buzzing of the fluorescent light overhead. I thought about the sheer arrogance required for Cameron to believe he could orchestrate such a complex legal kidnapping without leaving fatal vulnerabilities in his own design. He assumed that because I spent my weekends tending to my garden and drinking cheap coffee on my back porch, my intellect had dulled. He assumed my quiet retirement was a symptom of irrelevance. He had mistaken my chosen simplicity for weakness, failing to realize that a man who builds an empire from nothing never truly forgets how to dismantle a threat. The detective slammed his hand against the table one final time, frustrated by his inability to elicit a response. He snatched the medical affidavit and the bank statements, declaring that the conversation was over and that my transfer to the psychiatric wing would be expedited. He turned his back on me, grabbing the metal handle of the heavy door to leave me to my fate. Just as the latch clicked, the handle was forcibly turned from the outside, pushing the detective back into the cold room. The detective leaned so close I could smell the stale tobacco and peppermint gum on his breath. He slapped his open palm against the metal table, a sharp, echoing crack meant to shatter my composure. He was feeding off his own momentum, spinning a narrative of a broken, senile old man who was going to spend his final years wearing a state-issued gown in a locked ward. He pointed a thick finger at the forged medical affidavit, his voice dropping into a theatrical, mocking whisper, promising me that Amanda and Cameron were already finalizing the paperwork to take control of my life. He wanted me to break. He wanted tears. He wanted the pathetic, desperate plea of a cornered victim. I gave him absolutely nothing. I sat with my hands resting calmly on the table, feeling the cold bite of the steel handcuffs against my wrists. I counted his blinks. I measured the subtle tremor in his jaw. He was angry because my silence robbed him of his authority. In his world, a suspect either fought back or surrendered. I was doing neither. I was simply waiting. I knew the precise layout of the chessboard, and I knew that this detective was nothing more than a pawn being maneuvered by my son-in-law. Cameron thought he had masterminded the perfect crime sealing me in this concrete box while he drained my assets. He failed to understand that the box was not a prison. It was a staging ground. The detective mistook my silence for catatonia. He sneered, grabbing the forged bank statements and shoving them into my face, demanding I explain the offshore routing numbers. He was mid-sentence, his voice echoing off the cinder block walls, when the heavy steel door of the interrogation room suddenly clicked. It was not the slow, hesitant opening of a subordinate officer bringing in a cup of coffee. The deadbolt disengaged with a sharp, heavy thud, and the door was thrown inward with an absolute, terrifying authority. The hinges groaned in protest. The detective whipped around his hand instinctively, dropping toward his duty belt, his face twisting into a mask of pure outrage at the interruption. Alexander Pierce stepped into the freezing room. The contrast was jarring, almost violently so. In a room stained with decades of desperation and cheap bleach, Alexander looked like a sovereign stepping onto a conquered battlefield. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit cut with microscopic precision, his silver hair impeccably styled, his posture radiating the kind of wealth that does not need to shout to be recognized. He did not look at the peeling paint on the walls. He did not look at the security camera mounted in the corner. And most devastatingly, to the man in charge of the room, he did not even glance at the detective. Alexander moved with a predatory grace, stepping around the metal table and setting a slender hand-stitched leather briefcase directly over the detective's scattered forged evidence. The soft thud of the leather against the aluminum sounded like a gavel falling. Only then did Alexander look at me. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto mine, taking in the handcuffs, the sterile environment, and the complete lack of fear on my face. A slow, knowing smile spread across his lips, erasing the decades since we had last stood shoulder to shoulder in a boardroom dismantling hostile corporate raiders. "Welcome back, my friend Alexander," said his voice, rich, resonant, and completely devoid of panic. "It has been far too long." The words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. To the detective, it was a bizarre greeting for a delusional suspect facing 20 years for wire fraud. But to me, it was the activation code. 30 years ago, Alexander and I had built Vanguard Holdings from a single windowless office. When my wife fell ill, I stepped into the shadows, handing him the public reins of the empire so I could focus on my family. I chose to live quietly, to raise Amanda in a normal neighborhood, to wear flannel shirts and drive an old truck. I traded the boardroom for a basement workshop, retaining my silent, absolute majority control of Vanguard from behind the scenes. Alexander had spent the last decade running the empire, waiting for the day I would call. Tonight, Cameron's pathetic attempt at wire fraud had triggered the automatic security protocols I had hardwired into the Vanguard mainframe. I did not need to make a phone call. The system had alerted Alexander the moment my son-in-law tried to steal my life. The detective finally found his voice. His face turned a deep mottled red, his authority completely undermined by this immaculately dressed intruder. He stepped forward, squaring his shoulders, trying to reclaim the physical space of the room. "Who the hell are you?" The detective barked, his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his sidearm. "This is a restricted interrogation. You are interfering with an active felony investigation. Back away from the table and get out of my room before I throw you in a cell next to him." Alexander did not retreat. He did not even turn his head. He slowly unfastened the brass clasps of his briefcase, the metallic clicks echoing loudly in the tense silence. The detective's patience snapped. The humiliation of being ignored pushed him over the edge. He drew his weapon. The harsh scrape of the pistol leaving its holster was unmistakable. He aimed the barrel straight at the floor, adopting a wide, aggressive stance, his finger hovering near the trigger guard. He shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline, ordering Alexander to put his hands on the wall. I watched the barrel of the gun. My pulse did not elevate. Alexander calmly finished opening his briefcase. He reached inside, his movements deliberate and unhurried, demonstrating an absolute chilling disregard for the firearm drawn mere feet from his chest. He understood what the detective did not. True power is never loud, and it never needs to resort to violence. Alexander turned slowly, facing the detective for the first time. He did not raise his hands. Instead, he extended his arm, holding a single heavy sheet of cream-colored paper. It was completely silent as the document hovered in the space between them. "Put the gun away," Detective Alexander said softly, his tone carrying the cold, crushing weight of an avalanche. "You are currently pointing a county-issued firearm at the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. And the man sitting in handcuffs behind me, the man you have illegally detained on fabricated evidence, is my majority shareholder." The detective hesitated, his eyes darting between Alexander's unwavering gaze and the document extended toward him. Reluctantly keeping his weapon drawn but lowered, he snatched the paper from Alexander's hand. I watched the detective's eyes scan the page. The document bore a raised, embossed federal seal gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was not a local injunction. It was a preemptive federal mandate flanked by a certified copy of the Vanguard corporate charter. Alexander stepped closer to the detective, invading his space, reversing the dynamic entirely. He spoke clearly, his voice projecting not just to the man with the gun, but to the recording equipment humming behind the two-way mirror. "You are holding a man for wire fraud," Alexander stated, pointing at the forged bank statements scattered under his briefcase. "You claim he transferred $250,000 from his daughter's accounts to offshore routing numbers. Look at the charter in your hand, detective. Look at the listed holding accounts." The detective's eyes darted back to the paperwork. I saw the exact second his mind processed the catastrophic error he had made. His hands began to tremble, crinkling the thick paper. The routing numbers Cameron had planted in my study, the numbers printed on the supposed evidence of my crime, matched the federal charter perfectly. They were not untraceable offshore havens used by a desperate old man. They were the highly regulated, heavily monitored corporate acquisition accounts belonging to a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. "The man you have handcuffed to that chair did not steal anything," Alexander continued, his voice slicing through the detective's rising panic. "He owns the very accounts you are accusing him of transferring money into. You have arrested a billionaire for depositing his own phantom funds into his own company. Furthermore, the medical affidavit you are using to hold him against his will was signed by a clinic that Vanguard Holdings purchased outright 3 years ago. We know exactly which physician signed it, and our legal team is already stripping his medical license as we speak." The detective slowly lowered his weapon, sliding it back into its holster, with a shaky, defeated click. The aggressive, towering interrogator from 5 minutes ago vanished, replaced by a man realizing he had just stepped onto a landmine that was going to obliterate his career, his pension, and his precinct. He had bypassed basic procedural verification, eager to close a case handed to him by a weeping daughter and a seemingly cooperative son-in-law. He had taken Cameron's forged evidence at face value, completely unaware that he had arrested one of the most powerful men in the state. Alexander leaned down, placing his hands flat on the metal table, staring directly into the two-way mirror. He addressed the unseen precinct captain, who was undoubtedly watching the disaster unfold from the observation room. "Release the handcuffs," Alexander commanded, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Release him immediately, or the federal lawsuit I file before the sun comes up will ensure this entire precinct is liquidated to pay for the damages. The heavy steel door opened again, this time slowly, hesitantly. The precinct captain stepped inside, his face completely pale, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He nodded frantically to the detective. The detective fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them twice before managing to unlock the steel cuffs binding my wrists. I stood up, slowly rubbing the raw skin of my wrists, letting the silence command the room once more. I looked at the detective, watching him shrink under my gaze. I did not yell. I did not threaten him. I simply picked up the forged bank statements Cameron had planted, folded them neatly, and slid them into my pocket. My daughter and her husband believed they could use the blunt instrument of local law enforcement to silence me. They believed they could lock me in a psychiatric ward, steal my property, and erase my legacy before breakfast. They had unleashed a storm, hoping it would wash me away. They did not realize I owned the weather. I turned to Alexander, nodding once. "Let us go to work. We have a family to bankrupt." The precinct captain stood in the doorway with his hands raised in a gesture of complete surrender, but the lead detective refused to yield immediately. His chest heaved under his wrinkled shirt as he stared at the corporate charter resting on the aluminum table. He looked at the unlocked handcuffs and then glared back at Alexander. His stubborn pride was fighting a losing battle against the reality crashing down around him. He insisted that a piece of paper with a fancy logo did not simply invalidate a felony arrest. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at my chest and stated that the bank statements clearly showed a massive transfer of stolen funds. He demanded to know why my personal computer was the origin point of the wire fraud if I was entirely innocent. He clung desperately to his fabricated narrative, because admitting he was wrong meant admitting he had been played for an absolute fool by a weeping woman and a desperate son-in-law. He warned Alexander that interfering with the federal wire fraud case was a quick way to end up in the cell right next to me. Alexander closed the brass clasps of his briefcase with a soft, sharp click. He turned his attention fully to the detective, and his voice filled the small concrete room. He spoke with a smooth, polished edge that cut straight through the freezing air. He explained that the detective was looking at a man he believed to be a broke retired machinist, scraping by on a modest monthly pension. Alexander allowed a cold, humorless smile to touch his lips. He stated very clearly that Vincent Blackwood was not a pensioner. He told the detective that 30 years ago he and I had built Vanguard Holdings from the ground up in a single windowless office. He explained that I was not merely a silent partner or a lucky investor. I was the founder and the absolute majority shareholder of an international financial conglomerate. Alexander walked slowly around the metal table and pointed down at the forged bank statements Cameron had planted in my study. He explained that those specific offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands did not belong to my daughter. They belonged exclusively to the Vanguard corporate umbrella. They were restricted multi-signature holding accounts used solely for massive international corporate acquisitions. He made it perfectly clear that Cameron had inadvertently tried to frame a billionaire for stealing his own phantom corporate funds. The detective wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. He argued weakly that the transfer was still initiated from my personal home network, making me the prime suspect, regardless of who actually owned the offshore accounts. Alexander did not argue with the desperate man. He simply opened a sleek silver laptop he had pulled from his briefcase and turned the glowing screen toward the detective. He explained that Vanguard security protocols were automatically triggered the absolute second an unauthorized wire transfer was attempted on those restricted corporate accounts. Our dedicated cyber forensics team had traced the entire digital footprint before the local police even received the fake emergency dispatch call. Alexander tapped the laptop screen. He showed the detective the exact IP address of the device that actually initiated the fraudulent transfer. He read the long string of numbers aloud and let them echo in the quiet, freezing room. Then he pulled up a secondary trace screen. It displayed the registered legal owner of that specific IP address. It did not match my suburban home network. It matched a commercial server registered to a failing tech startup located in the downtown financial district. It was Cameron's private office server. Alexander explained that Cameron had used a sloppy remote access portal to bounce the transaction through my home computer. Cameron had left a massive and undeniable digital trail pointing directly back to his own failing business. The detective stared down at the glowing laptop screen as the remaining color drained entirely from his face. The digital evidence was completely irrefutable. He had forcefully arrested the victim of a crime and left the actual criminals comforting each other in the precinct lobby. The precinct captain finally stepped fully into the interrogation room. He ordered the detective to stand down immediately and step away from the table. The captain apologized profusely with his voice shaking as he assured Alexander and myself that all criminal charges would be dropped instantly. He promised that all records of this arrest would be expunged from the system before the sun came up. I stood up from the cold metal chair and rubbed my wrists where the steel cuffs had bitten deeply into my skin. I did not accept the precinct captain's nervous apology. I simply walked past the defeated detective and left him to process the catastrophic end of his career. I walked down the sterile, brightly lit hallway of the police precinct with Alexander close beside me. We bypassed the main public lobby entirely by using a secure side exit to avoid my daughter and her husband. The freezing night air hit my face as we stepped out into the private rear parking lot. Alexander's armored black town car was waiting nearby with the heavy engine running smoothly. Before I could reach for the door handle, Alexander placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His expression had shifted drastically from corporate triumph to genuine grim concern. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He told me that our cyber team had found something else while digging through Cameron's digital footprint. He handed the paper to me and I read the stark black text under the glow of a nearby security light. Cameron had not just framed me to hide his massive business debts. He had actively leveraged the physical deed to my residential property. My son-in-law had forged my signature on a commercial loan application. He had used my family home as collateral to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars from a highly dangerous and predatory real estate developer. Alexander spoke very quietly over the low hum of the car engine. He told me that Cameron's aggressive investors were threatening his life, and my home was the only liquid asset keeping him breathing. The predatory loan was defaulting today. If we did not act immediately, the developer would legally seize my property by noon. The false arrest at 2 a.m. was merely a distraction to keep me locked in a psychiatric ward while they finalized the permanent sale of my stolen home. The city blurred past the tinted windows of Alexander's town car. I did not look back at the police precinct as we merged onto the desolate morning highway. The freezing air outside mirrored the sudden, absolute stillness settling into my chest. The emergency conservatorship Amanda had secured in the dead of night meant my home was legally hostile territory. If I stepped foot onto my own driveway before that fraudulent injunction was officially killed in front of a judge, Cameron could legally call the police and have me dragged away for trespassing on my own estate. It was a brilliant and suffocating legal knot designed to keep me paralyzed on the street while they dismantled my life. But they had tied that knot around the wrong man. We arrived at the Vanguard corporate tower in the heart of the financial district. We bypassed the sprawling marble lobby and took the private executive elevator straight to the 75th floor. This was the penthouse war room. It was a space designed exclusively for dismantling rival corporations, walled entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass that looked down on the sleeping city like a predator watching its hunting ground. The room was cold, efficient, and humming with the low vibration of encrypted servers. Bennett Reed was already waiting for us. Bennett was Vanguard's apex corporate attorney, a man whose blood ran freezing cold and whose billable hours routinely decimated fortunes. He stood over a massive glass conference table that was completely covered in financial dossiers, forensic accounting printouts, and server logs. He did not ask how I was feeling after spending the night in police custody. He did not offer useless sympathies about my daughter plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He simply pointed to the center of the illuminated glass table and told me to look at the anatomy of a desperate man. I approached the table and looked down at the sprawling paper trail of my daughter's existence. For the past 5 years, Amanda and Cameron had put on a flawless performance of immense success. They drove matching imported luxury vehicles. They hosted lavish catered dinner parties for their social circle. Amanda wore designer clothes and casually complained about the waiting lists for their exclusive country club memberships during our Sunday dinners. I had always assumed Cameron's tech startup was thriving, and I had intentionally stayed out of their business out of respect for their independence. I had wanted Amanda to feel the pride of earning her place in the world. The black ink spread across the glass table told a violently different story. It was an illusion. All of it was a hollow, rotting facade built entirely on suffocating and inescapable debt. Bennett tapped a sleek silver pen against a thick stack of credit card statements. He explained that Amanda and Cameron had 31 maxed-out lines of credit spread across dozens of shadow banks. The luxury vehicles were not owned. They were on predatory leases that were currently 4 months in arrears, and the bank was actively hunting the vehicles for immediate repossession. The country club membership had been quietly revoked a year ago for severe non-payment. They were entirely bankrupt. I moved down the length of the table reading the forensic autopsy of their lives. Cameron's startup was not merely failing. It had never been profitable for a single day of its existence. He had burned through his initial venture capital in the first 8 months, squandering the funds on high-end office spaces and executive retreats simply to maintain the appearance of being a visionary CEO. When the legitimate money ran out, he started taking out shadow loans to keep the lights on. Bennett slid a heavily highlighted financial profile toward my hands. He explained that Cameron had borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who do not use traditional banks. He had taken massive loans from violent, unregulated private equity lenders who demanded exorbitant weekly interest rates. When the interest compounded entirely beyond his ability to pay, Cameron panicked. He needed liquid cash, and he needed a massive amount of it immediately, or his creditors were going to start breaking bones. But even that was not the true horror of the dossier. The ultimate betrayal was found hidden deep within Amanda's personal spending logs. I stared at the dates of her most reckless expenditures. 6 years ago, when my wife Diana was slowly losing her agonizing battle with illness, I had been completely consumed with hospital visits and palliative care. I had been an absent father during those dark months. During that exact window of time, Amanda had quietly requested a series of small, 6-figure loans from me, claiming Cameron desperately needed seed money for his brilliant new software. I had written the checks without looking at the business plans, because my mind was tethered to my dying wife. I had wanted to believe my daughter was securing her future while I was losing mine. Bennett tapped the corresponding dates on the glass. Amanda had never given a single dime of that money to Cameron's business. The forensic trace showed she had funneled every single dollar into a private account to fund her own lifestyle. She had used the money I gave her to buy her way into high society circles, purchasing status and influence, while her mother withered away in a hospital bed. I had inadvertently bankrolled the creation of the very monster who had just tried to lock me in a cage. I stood completely still, staring at the hard, undeniable math of my failure as a father. I had taught Amanda that she was entitled to comfort, but I had completely failed to teach her the brutal cost of reality. I had paid away her early mistakes, and in doing so, I had taught her that consequences simply did not apply to her. When the real world finally came to collect, she did not know how to survive. She only knew how to steal. Alexander walked to the far side of the glass table and poured 2 glasses of neat bourbon. He slid one across the smooth surface toward me. He said that a desperate animal will chew off its own leg to escape a trap, but a desperate human will chew off the leg of anyone standing next to them. Cameron and Amanda were drowning in a sea of violent debt, and they had decided that my freedom was an acceptable price for their survival. I picked up the heavy crystal glass, but did not drink. The burning anger deep in my chest suddenly crystallized into something entirely devoid of heat. It was absolute freezing clarity. They thought I was a relic. They thought they could simply forge a medical document, throw me in a padded cell, and feed my estate to their creditors before anyone noticed I was missing. Bennett cleared his throat, pulling my attention sharply back to the immediate crisis at hand. He pulled a bright red folder from the bottom of the stack and flipped it open. He stated that the fraudulent wire transfer and the fake emergency conservatorship were only smokescreens. They were stalling tactics designed to keep me neutralized and out of communication for exactly 12 hours. The real threat was the commercial loan Cameron had taken out using my family home as collateral. Bennett pushed a copy of the forged property deed across the glass. He explained the exact mechanics of the trap. Cameron owed $250,000 to a predatory real estate developer named Arthur Sterling. Sterling was not a man who operated within the bounds of standard ethics. He was a corporate scavenger who specifically targeted desperate borrowers, waiting for them to inevitably default so he could seize their prime assets for pennies on the dollar. Cameron had promised Sterling my sprawling estate to cover the debt. Amanda had used the power of the emergency conservatorship to forge my signature on the transfer documents while I was sitting in the interrogation room. The legal closing was scheduled to happen today at exactly noon. If Sterling signed those papers, the title of my home would transfer to his development firm irrevocably. Sterling would immediately liquidate the property. Cameron would pay off his violent creditors with his cut, and Amanda would walk away with enough stolen cash to maintain her pathetic illusion of wealth for a few more years. I looked at the digital clock glowing faintly on the wall of the war room. It was currently 6 a.m. We had exactly 6 hours before Amanda handed my home the house where I had raised her, and the house where my wife had died over to a corporate vulture. Bennett cracked his knuckles and looked at me with a dangerous, eager light in his eyes. He said he had already drafted a massive injunction. He was fully prepared to wake up a federal judge, storm the courthouse, and legally block the sale. He promised he could freeze all of Amanda and Cameron's remaining assets, drag them into a suffocating legal battle, and tie the property deed up in aggressive litigation for the next decade. I set the untouched glass of bourbon down on the table. The sharp clink of the crystal echoed loudly in the quiet room. I looked at Bennett and told him to stand down. I told him we were not going to the courthouse to beg a judge to stop the sale. We were not going to fight a defensive war against thieves. I instructed him to leave the injunction in his briefcase and prepare the Vanguard acquisition team for an immediate hostile takeover. I leaned closer to the glass table, tracing the sprawling web of transactions Bennett had laid out before me. The initial shock of my daughter's betrayal had evaporated, leaving only the cold, sterile need to dissect the mechanics of her failure. I needed to understand the exact catalyst. I needed to pinpoint the exact moment Cameron and Amanda shifted from living a pathetic lie to actively plotting my physical and financial ruin. Bennett handed me a thick stack of bank records outlining Amanda's personal checking history over the last 5 years. I stared at the columns of black ink, watching a horrifying pattern emerge. The numbers painted a portrait of a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. There were massive charges for luxury boutiques, exclusive spa retreats, and exorbitant monthly minimums on credit cards I did not even know she possessed. But it was not the current spending that caught my attention. It was a specific pattern of deposits originating from my own personal accounts precisely 5 years ago. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second as the memory hit me. 5 years ago, my wife Diana was in the final agonizing stages of her illness. The hospital visits were endless, and my mind was entirely consumed by the sound of her failing breath and the sterile smell of the palliative care ward. I was drowning in grief, watching the woman I had loved for 4 decades slip away. During those dark months, Amanda had come to me sobbing perfectly. She claimed she had made a few small financial mistakes and that the stress was ruining her marriage. She begged for a small loan just to get back on her feet. I did not ask questions. I did not audit her claims. I simply wrote the checks. I wrote one to clear her credit cards. I wrote another to cover a supposedly unexpected tax burden for Cameron's business. I kept writing checks because my grief had made me weak, and I wanted to believe that at least one person in my family could be saved. Staring at the glass table, I finally understood the magnitude of my own mistake. I had not saved her. I had enabled her. I had taken a young woman who needed to learn the hard, brutal lessons of consequence, and I had taught her that consequence was merely an illusion. I had trained her to believe that there would always be a bailout, a magic check, a wealthy father willing to absorb the damage of her reckless choices. I had built this monster out of my own misplaced love, and now that monster was trying to swallow me whole. I set the paper down and looked across the table at Bennett. The past was irrelevant now. I asked him to focus entirely on the present. I needed to know exactly why the trap had been sprung tonight. Why did Cameron decide that a Tuesday morning at 2:00 was the exact moment to forge bank statements and call the police with a fake medical diagnosis? Bennett tapped his tablet rapidly, his eyes darting across the glowing screen as he pulled up the encrypted communications of Cameron's shadow lenders. The corporate attorney explained that a desperate man only makes a move this catastrophic when a gun is literally pointed at his head. Cameron had taken out a massive loan from a violent syndicate of unregulated private equity lenders, and he had missed his final extension payment 48 hours ago. The lenders had sent Cameron a very specific message. Bennett read the intercepted text aloud, detailing a clear and graphic threat against Cameron and Amanda if a payment of $250,000 was not made in full by the end of the week. That was the exact catalyst. That was the reason for the sloppy wire fraud. Cameron tried to steal the $250,000 directly from what he thought was my personal checking account to save his own life. But the wire fraud had failed. My automated Vanguard security protocols had frozen the transaction the second it was initiated. Cameron and Amanda were still deeply in the hole, and their violent creditors were already closing in. Alexander stepped forward from the shadows of the penthouse, his face set in grim lines. He stated that desperate people do not simply give up when their first plan fails. If they could not wire the cash, they would have to liquidate a hard asset immediately. Bennett's fingers flew across his keyboard, accessing the county property registry in real time. The attorney's face drained of color as a new document populated on the large monitor mounted on the war room wall. He told me to look at the screen. It was a digital copy of the deed to my estate. The property where I had built my life, where Diana had planted her rose gardens, and where Amanda had taken her first steps. Attached to the deed was a rapidly expedited transfer of ownership form. The signature at the bottom was a flawless forgery of my own handwriting, authorized by the fake emergency medical conservatorship Amanda had secured from the corrupt clinic. Bennett spoke with a chilling urgency. He explained that Amanda was not waiting around to see if the wire fraud cleared. She was already executing a secondary fail-safe. She was selling my family home out from under me. I asked who was buying a multi-million-dollar estate on zero notice. Bennett pulled up the buyer profile. The name on the acquisition firm belonged to Arthur Sterling. Sterling was a notorious corporate scavenger, a predatory real estate developer who built his entire fortune by targeting desperate individuals. He specialized in finding people who needed untraceable cash in a matter of hours and buying their prime assets for a fraction of their actual market value. Sterling did not ask questions about forged medical documents or sudden midnight conservatorships. He only cared about acquiring premium real estate for pennies on the dollar. Alexander pointed to the digital timestamp on the transfer document. He stated that Arthur Sterling and Amanda were not merely discussing a potential sale. They had already drafted the final closing documents. Bennett looked at his watch, his jaw tight with tension. He explained the absolute severity of the timeline. The emergency conservatorship gave Amanda the legal authority to sign on my behalf as long as I was deemed medically incapacitated. Because the police had taken me away in handcuffs based on the forged medical affidavit, Amanda possessed all the leverage she needed. She had scheduled a private closing meeting with Arthur Sterling at his downtown high-rise office. I stared at the glowing red numbers of the digital clock on the wall. It was currently 8 in the morning. Bennett delivered the final devastating blow. He stated that the closing was scheduled for exactly 12 noon today. In exactly 4 hours, Amanda would sit across a polished table from Arthur Sterling and sign away the title to my home. Sterling would immediately wire the cash to an untraceable offshore account. Amanda and Cameron would pay off their violent lenders, and I would be left completely homeless, legally trapped in a psychiatric ward, with no physical assets to my name. The air in the war room grew suffocatingly thin. The sheer velocity of their betrayal was staggering. They had weaponized my love, stripped me of my legal rights, and were now preparing to sell the very roof over my head, all before I was even supposed to be allowed a phone call from the precinct holding cell. They believed I was currently sitting in a padded room, heavily sedated and utterly powerless to stop them. They were entirely wrong. I turned away from the monitors and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling financial district. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the glass towers of the city. My reflection stared back at me, superimposed over the skyline. There was no sadness left in my eyes. The father who had enabled his daughter was dead, completely burned away by the reality of her actions. All that remained was the silent founder of Vanguard Holdings. I looked back at Bennett and Alexander. We had 4 hours until Amanda tried to sell my life to a corporate vulture. I did not intend to be late for the meeting. Bennett Reed did not hesitate for a single second. The moment I rejected his initial proposal, he pivoted seamlessly back to his encrypted laptop. His fingers hammered across the keyboard with the frantic precision of a man who dealt in financial ruin for a living. The high-speed printer in the corner of the penthouse war room hummed to life instantly, spitting out thick stacks of legal documents. Bennett was operating on pure adrenaline and legal instinct. He explained his strategy without looking up from the glowing screen. He had an emergency injunction already drafted. He knew a federal judge who owed Vanguard a substantial favor and was currently eating breakfast at a private club 3 blocks away. Bennett promised me that with one phone call, he could have a microscopic legal freeze placed on my residential deed by 9 in the morning. The injunction would immediately halt the noon closing. It would legally paralyze Amanda and Cameron, locking them in a room with a furious predatory developer and absolutely no way to deliver the property they had promised. Bennett tore the freshly printed pages from the tray and slammed them onto the glass table. He held out a gold-plated pen, demanding my signature. He was a shark smelling blood in the water, offering me the fastest way to stop the bleeding. I did not take the pen. I looked down at the immaculate legal document. It was a flawless piece of defensive litigation. It would absolutely save my house today. But saving the house was no longer my primary objective. I reached across the cold glass of the conference table and pushed the injunction back toward Bennett. I kept my voice entirely level, devoid of any elevated emotion. I told my attorney that we were not filing a single piece of defensive paperwork. Bennett froze, his hand hovering over the table, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He argued that if we did not file the injunction, Arthur Sterling would legally assume the title to my estate at 12 noon sharp. I told Bennett that an injunction was a shield, and I had absolutely no use for a shield. If we blocked the sale this morning, we would undoubtedly stop the immediate transfer of the deed. But it would also act as a blaring alarm bell. It would signal to Amanda that the emergency conservatorship had failed. It would alert Cameron that his forged bank statements had been discovered. It would give them the most valuable resource a cornered animal can possess, which is time. Time to run. Time to hide the remaining stolen funds. Time to manufacture a new lie. Blocking the sale would only delay the inevitable confrontation. I did not want to delay them. I wanted them to walk willingly into the absolute center of the trap, believing they held all the power right up until the floor collapsed beneath their feet. Furthermore, I told Bennett we were ignoring the most dangerous variable in the equation. Arthur Sterling was not a standard real estate investor. He was a corporate scavenger. He targeted desperate families and bought their distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. If we merely blocked the sale today, Sterling would simply retreat, circle the perimeter, and wait for another opportunity to strike. He would realize there was a legal dispute over the property, and he would throw his own vicious lawyers into the fray. I refused to spend the next 5 years fighting a bottom-feeding developer in civil court over the rights to my own home. Alexander Pierce leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette outlined by the rising morning sun. He watched me with a silent, profound understanding. He knew exactly where my mind was going, because we had utilized this exact maneuver 30 years ago to build the very foundation of Vanguard Holdings. I turned my attention entirely away from my daughter and focused strictly on the developer. I explained to Bennett the fundamental reality of men like Arthur Sterling. Sterling operated by flashing massive amounts of liquid cash to desperate people. But in order to keep that much cash completely liquid, his actual development company had to be leveraged to the absolute hilt. Sterling did not build skyscrapers with his own money. He operated on high-yield short-term mezzanine debt. He borrowed millions from aggressive commercial lenders to maintain his predatory empire. He was highly exposed and heavily reliant on a continuous stream of incoming acquisitions to service his own massive debts. I looked at Alexander and gave the direct order. I told him to wake up the Vanguard corporate acquisition team immediately. I did not care that it was barely dawn. I wanted our analysts tearing through Sterling's financial architecture. I wanted to know exactly which commercial bank held the paper on Sterling's operational debt. Bennett slowly lowered his gold pen to the table. The aggressive frustration in his eyes completely vanished, replaced by a cold, dawning realization. He finally understood the architecture of my retaliation. We were not going to step between Amanda and the developer. We were going to swallow the developer whole. I instructed Alexander that once our team identified the primary holder of Sterling's corporate debt, Vanguard was going to execute an immediate hostile buyout. We would not negotiate a polite transfer. We would aggressively purchase every single outstanding note, every mortgage, and every line of credit attached to Arthur Sterling and his development firm. If the holding bank hesitated, Alexander was authorized to pay a ridiculous premium to acquire the paper instantly. Money was no longer an object. Control was the only currency that mattered. By 11:30 this morning, I wanted Vanguard Holdings to be the sole owner of Arthur Sterling's operational debt. I wanted to hold the absolute power to call in his loans and completely bankrupt his firm with a single phone call. Alexander did not waste a single word in reply. He simply opened his phone and began issuing the directives that would mobilize billions of dollars of corporate power before the city had even finished its morning coffee. The war room filled with the quiet, rapid-fire sounds of executives dismantling a target from the shadows. I walked back to the glass table and looked down at the forged deed Amanda intended to sign. The genius of the maneuver settled into the quiet space of the room. When my daughter and her panicked husband walked into that high-rise conference room at noon, they would believe they were selling my home to a ruthless stranger. They would believe they were escaping their own disastrous choices by sacrificing my life. They had absolutely no idea that when Arthur Sterling sat down at the head of that table to sign the final papers, he would no longer be an independent predator. By noon, Arthur Sterling would be an entirely owned subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings. He would be my employee. Amanda thought she was bringing a wolf to our door. She did not realize I had just bought the entire forest. I told Bennett to pack his briefcase because we were going to attend a real estate closing. Bennett reached for the handle of his leather briefcase, but his hands suddenly stopped. His eyes darted back to the glowing monitor as a silent alert flashed across the encrypted communication portal. Vanguard had deployed an elite cybersecurity team to shadow Cameron and his crumbling tech startup hours ago. They had completely breached the personal network belonging to Cameron and were now monitoring every digital transmission entering or leaving his devices. Bennett leaned over the glass table and pulled up a live intercept of a text message exchange between Amanda and her husband. The corporate attorney read the rolling text, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. I walked back to the table and looked down at the intercepted messages. Amanda was not discussing the upcoming real estate closing with Arthur Sterling. She was coordinating a logistical nightmare. She was confirming the arrival of a private and entirely unlicensed medical transport team. She had bypassed the standard state hospital system and paid a massive cash premium to a black site medical contractor. Her messages detailed a cold and calculated directive to execute a hostile extraction. She was not waiting for a judge to review the emergency conservatorship or for a state doctor to evaluate my actual mental health. She was paying mercenaries to simply erase me from the board. Bennett tapped his keyboard and accessed the municipal traffic cameras surrounding the police precinct we had just evacuated. He brought the live video feed onto the main wall monitor. A heavy white passenger van with aggressively tinted windows and absolutely no official medical markings pulled directly into the rear parking lot. It idled exactly where the armored town car belonging to Alexander had been parked just an hour ago. 4 massive men, dressed in unmarked dark tactical scrubs, stepped out of the vehicle. They did not move or look like orderlies or medical professionals. They moved like private military contractors hired to disappear a highly volatile problem. I stared at the silent video feed and let the absolute depravity of my daughter wash over me. She did not just want to steal my family home and liquidate my assets. She needed me permanently and physically silenced. She knew the forged emergency conservatorship was an incredibly fragile legal maneuver. She knew it would completely disintegrate the very second I was allowed to speak with a legitimate judge or a corporate attorney. To prevent that inevitable legal collapse, she had arranged for this black site transport team to drag me to an off-the-grid facility. It was a place where I would be heavily sedated and stripped of all human communication. She intended to bury me alive while my heart was still beating. Bennett read the final intercepted text message aloud to the quiet room. Amanda had instructed the mercenary team to wait by the precinct loading dock. She had explicitly told them that the police captain was expecting to release a highly delusional and combative suspect directly into their custody. She had transferred an additional $10,000 to their account to ensure the physical extraction was forceful, swift, and completely uncompromising. They were instructed to ignore any of my pleas or statements regarding my identity or my wealth. Alexander stood beside me with his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered visibly under his skin. He stated with a deadly calm that if we had lingered at the police precinct for even 10 more minutes, we would have walked directly into a physical ambush. If we had stayed to file a formal complaint against the corrupt detective or waited for the captain to finish his paperwork, those mercenaries would have cornered us in the lobby. Amanda had orchestrated an absolutely perfect trap. The police believed they were handing a sick old man over to a legitimate medical facility, and the transport team knew they were being paid a premium to ignore my screams. The war room fell into a heavy and suffocating silence as we watched the unmarked white van idle on the precinct camera feed. Bennett looked at me and asked for permission to deploy Vanguard physical security personnel to the police station. He wanted to intercept the mercenaries immediately. He wanted to surround their van with our corporate security forces and have them arrested on the spot for attempted kidnapping. Bennett was furious, and he wanted to crush the pawns standing in our way. I shook my head slowly and ordered Bennett to stand down immediately. I told him that engaging the transport team would achieve absolutely nothing except giving away our only tactical advantage. Arresting 4 hired thugs in a precinct parking lot would instantly alert Amanda that her flawless plan had failed. If she received a panicked phone call from her mercenaries stating that I was missing or protected by heavily armed corporate security, she would immediately abort the real estate closing. She would realize the trap was empty, and she would take whatever stolen cash she had left and vanish into the wind before we could bring the hammer down. I explained to Alexander and Bennett that we must maintain the absolute illusion of her total victory. Amanda needed to believe that I was currently being strapped to a gurney and driven far beyond the city limits. She needed to walk into the real estate conference room belonging to Arthur Sterling with the supreme unchecked arrogance of a woman who believed she had successfully erased her own father from existence. That towering arrogance was the precise and fatal weakness we were going to exploit. I instructed Bennett to leave the precinct surveillance feed running, but to ignore the white van entirely. I told him to focus every ounce of his attention and every particle of Vanguard corporate power on Arthur Sterling and the commercial debt he carried. I demanded that the hostile acquisition of the developer and his holding company be completely finalized and legally binding before Amanda even sat down in her leather chair at the closing table. I wanted Sterling to belong to me before he shook my daughter by the hand. I turned away from the glowing monitors and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the private elevator. Alexander and Bennett followed behind me in perfect synchronization. The time for gathering digital evidence was over. The time for defensive posturing and quiet audits was completely dead. We were leaving the penthouse war room to deliver the final catastrophic consequence directly to my daughter. We had a scheduled appointment at 12 noon, and we were going to show Amanda exactly what happens when you attempt to bury a man who owns the entire earth beneath your feet. It was exactly 11:45 in the morning when the private elevator chimed softly on the top floor of the Sterling Equities building. The polished marble hallways smelled of expensive citrus cologne and raw predatory ambition. We moved with the silent, synchronized precision of an execution squad marching toward the gallows. Alexander flanked my right side and Bennett walked to my left holding a single black leather folder. Through the massive glass walls of the central conference room, I could see the exact culmination of my daughter's betrayal playing out in absolute silence. Amanda sat rigidly at the head of a sprawling mahogany table. Cameron hovered nervously over her shoulder, with his eyes darting frantically between the thick stack of legal documents and the heavy silver wristwatch ticking on his arm. Sitting directly across from them was Arthur Sterling. He wore an immaculate slate-gray suit and the relaxed, comfortable smile of a man who knew he was stealing a fortune and getting away with it entirely. Amanda held a heavy silver fountain pen suspended mere inches above the final signature line of the fraudulent property deed. I recognized that specific pen instantly, and a freezing weight settled deep into my chest. I had special ordered that silver pen from a boutique in London and presented it to her on the day she graduated from university. I had told her to use it to write her own future and to sign her name only to things she could be genuinely proud of. I had wanted her to build a life of absolute integrity. Now she was clutching that exact same pen with her knuckles turning white from tension, preparing to forge my signature and sell the home where her mother had died. She was handing my estate over to a corporate scavenger simply to save a failing husband. I realized in that fraction of a second that I was entirely responsible for this monster. When my wife Diana passed away, I was consumed by a suffocating grief. During those dark months, Amanda had come to me sobbing about small financial mistakes and crushing credit card debt. I had quietly paid off every single one of her early failures without demanding a single explanation. I had inadvertently taught my daughter that actions do not carry actual consequences. I had trained her to believe that there would always be a bailout, and she was using that exact arrogance to destroy my life today. I did not knock on the glass. I did not announce my arrival to the receptionist. I simply placed my hands flat against the heavy double glass doors and pushed them inward with enough force to make the thick metal hinges groan in loud protest. The sound shattered the hushed, greedy intimacy of the conference room. All three heads snapped toward the doorway in perfect unison. Amanda froze completely. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers as all the blood drained rapidly from her face. The heavy silver fountain pen slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. A massive dark ink stain immediately began to spread across the pristine white surface of the forged deed, ruining the signature line entirely. They were expecting a broken man. They were expecting a confused and heavily sedated pensioner, wearing a state-issued hospital gown, screaming about conspiracies from the inside of a locked county psychiatric ward. Cameron had paid unlicensed mercenaries to ensure I was physically restrained and completely silenced by this exact hour. Instead, they were looking at the true architect of Vanguard Holdings. I wore a charcoal bespoke suit perfectly tailored and completely devoid of a single wrinkle. My posture was straight, and my expression was a mask of absolute freezing calm. Alexander and Bennett stood on either side of me, radiating the kind of crushing corporate authority that instantly dwarfed everything else in the room. Cameron was the first to break the paralysis. The desperate, fragile illusion he had constructed over the last 12 hours was completely evaporating right in front of his eyes. The violent shadow lenders were breathing down his neck, and his only financial lifeline was currently bleeding black ink onto the mahogany table. He leaped away from Amanda's chair with his face flushing a violent mottled crimson. He began shouting frantically, and his voice cracked with pure, unadulterated panic. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest and demanded to know how I had escaped the secure medical transport van. He yelled for someone to lock the doors and call the precinct captain immediately. Cameron spun toward Arthur Sterling and slammed his hands down on the table to demand the developer's attention. He screamed that I was a deeply delusional and highly dangerous man suffering from severe psychotic episodes. He completely fabricated a narrative on the spot, claiming I had violently escaped a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold and posed an immediate physical threat to everyone in the building. He begged Sterling to call building security and have me forcibly restrained and dragged back to the hospital. He frantically pushed the ink-stained deed toward Amanda and ordered her to pick up the pen and sign it right that second before I had a chance to become physically violent. He was deliberately trying to manipulate the developer into rushing the transaction under the guise of a tragic medical emergency. Arthur Sterling did not panic. He was a man who made his living navigating the chaotic desperation of failing businesses and ruined families. He recognized a volatile situation immediately, but he also recognized that he was mere seconds away from acquiring a multi-million-dollar suburban estate for a microscopic fraction of its actual market value. He was not about to let a deranged old man ruin the most lucrative acquisition of his fiscal quarter. Sterling stood up slowly and buttoned the center button of his expensive suit jacket. He looked at me with a cold, dismissive sneer. He did not see a billionaire corporate founder standing in his doorway. He only saw a senile obstacle standing between his firm and a massive profit margin. Sterling picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button connecting directly to his private security detail. He spoke clearly into the speakerphone, ordering 4 armed guards to report to the executive conference room immediately to handle a hostile trespasser. Then he dropped the receiver and turned his dead reptilian eyes toward me and Alexander. He stated in a low, threatening voice that we had exactly 30 seconds to turn around and walk out of his private office before he had us thrown face first onto the pavement downstairs. He declared that he was finalizing a perfectly legal and binding real estate transaction with the federally appointed conservator of my estate. He told me that my presence here was a criminal act of trespassing, and he would not hesitate to press felony charges and file a restraining order if I spoke a single word to interrupt the closing. Amanda sat frozen in her leather chair, entirely unable to speak or move. She stared at the ink spreading across the forged document, and then slowly looked up at my face. She was searching desperately for a shred of the weary, forgiving father who had quietly paid her debts and absorbed her endless mistakes for the past 5 years. She found absolutely nothing. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice to argue with Sterling or defend my sanity against Cameron's pathetic screaming. I simply stepped further into the room and allowed the heavy glass doors to swing shut behind us, trapping them inside with us. The sharp click of the magnetic lock, sealing us into the conference room, signaled the absolute end of their illusion. Sterling slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, demanding to know if we were completely deaf. He shouted that his security team was already in the elevator and we were about to leave his building in handcuffs. Cameron was practically hyperventilating as he urged Amanda to pick up the pen and sign the bottom line before the guards arrived. He needed the cash transfer initiated right this second before his violent investors found him. The tension in the room was pulled so tight it threatened to shatter the surrounding glass walls. Bennett Reed ignored the screaming men entirely. He stepped forward with cold, methodical grace and placed his black leather folder gently onto the mahogany table directly over the ruined property deed. He looked up at the furious developer and told him that calling security was a catastrophic miscalculation. Bennett Reed stood tall and completely unfazed by the chaotic screaming echoing off the glass walls of the executive conference room. He did not retreat a single inch when Arthur Sterling slammed his fist onto the mahogany table. The furious developer had just threatened to have us violently removed from the high-rise building, but his blustering aggression meant absolutely nothing to a man who routinely dismantled international corporations before lunch. Bennett kept his dark eyes locked entirely on Sterling and repeated that calling building security would be the final catastrophic mistake of his career. Amanda reached the absolute pinnacle of her desperation. She could see her entire fraudulent scheme collapsing into dust, and the suffocating reality of her violent shadow creditors was closing in around her throat. She lunged forward in her leather chair and frantically dug her shaking hands into her designer tote bag. She pulled out the forged medical affidavit and the emergency conservatorship paperwork she had acquired in the dead of night. She practically threw her body across the wide mahogany table, shoving the fabricated legal documents directly into the developer's hands. She spoke with a shrill, hysterical urgency that echoed terribly in the pristine corporate space. She insisted that Sterling ignore us entirely. She claimed I was suffering from severe, irreversible dementia, and that I had been completely stripped of all my legal rights by a federal judge. She demanded that he sign the bottom line of the property deed right that very second, so the wire transfer could be initiated. She begged him to push the deal through, promising that the estate was legally hers to sell, and that we were nothing more than deranged trespassers interfering with a lawful transaction. Cameron immediately joined the frantic assault. He leaped away from the wall and hovered over the developer, with sweat pouring down his pale face. He babbled uncontrollably about how the local police were already actively hunting for me. He tried to physically shield the forged documents with his own body, acting like a cornered rat backed against a wall. He told Sterling that this was a once-in-a-lifetime real estate opportunity, and that they could close the deal right now before the authorities arrived with straitjackets to take me away. He appealed directly to the developer's infamous greed. He promised to drop the asking price of my family home even further, taking a massive personal loss if Sterling would just sign the paper and wire the liquid cash to their offshore account immediately. Arthur Sterling looked down at the chaotic couple and then looked at the medical documents resting in his hands. His legendary greed was a powerful and blinding motivator. He wanted the sprawling suburban property, and he wanted it for the fraction of the cost they were offering. He saw the official-looking signatures and the heavy court stamps on the fake conservatorship paperwork. He believed those forged documents were a sufficient legal shield to protect his firm from any future liability. He raised his chin and looked at Bennett and Alexander with a smug, overwhelming sense of superiority. He stated that he held legally binding documents authorizing the immediate sale of the estate and that he did not care about our pathetic family drama. He reached out and picked up his heavy silver pen from the table, clearly intending to sign the contract and finalize the absolute theft of my home. He truly believed he was completely untouchable, sitting in his own private fortress. I did not raise my voice to argue with the arrogant developer. I did not reach out to physically snatch the pen from his trembling hand. I simply took a slow, deliberate step forward until I was standing directly over the center of the polished mahogany table. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The room fell into a sudden and suffocating silence as all three of them stopped breathing to watch my hand. I pulled out a single solid black titanium card. It was heavy and freezing cold to the touch. It bore no personal account numbers and no restrictive expiration dates. It carried only my full name and the deeply engraved silver insignia of Vanguard Holdings. I lowered my hand and placed the heavy titanium card directly over the wet ink stain on the forged property deed. The dull metallic thud of the solid metal hitting the wood resonated through the thick glass walls of the conference room. I told Arthur Sterling to look very closely at the insignia resting on the table before he put his pen to paper. He paused with the silver tip of his pen hovering mere inches above the signature line. His eyes dropped down to the solid black card. I watched the exact millisecond his brain processed the intricately engraved silver logo. The smug, arrogant sneer completely melted off his face like wax held to an open flame. The remaining color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. Arthur Sterling operated in the highest and most ruthless echelons of corporate real estate. He knew exactly what Vanguard Holdings was. He knew it was the absolute apex predator of the global financial market, capable of crushing regional developers without a second thought. He also recognized that the solid black titanium card was carried exclusively by the Supreme Executive Board of the conglomerate. He slowly lifted his eyes from the table to look at my face, and the terrifying realization physically locked his jaw in place. Before the developer could formulate a single coherent syllable, Bennett Reed stepped forward to execute the final blow. Bennett moved with the lethal, measured grace of an executioner stepping up to the block. He unclasped his black leather folder and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of certified legal documents. Each page was stamped with a bright red federal seal, proving it had been officially filed and verified just minutes ago by a federal magistrate. Bennett slid the thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany table until they rested directly against the developer's trembling hands. Bennett spoke in a voice that was smooth, polite, and utterly devoid of mercy. He explained that Sterling Equities did not operate on actual liquid cash. He stated that Sterling built his entire real estate portfolio using high-yield short-term commercial loans and aggressive mezzanine debt. Bennett pointed a long finger at the top document and explained that exactly 45 minutes ago, Vanguard Holdings had executed a hostile and total acquisition of every single line of credit belonging to Arthur Sterling. We had aggressively purchased all of his outstanding commercial mortgages, his operational loans, and his massive corporate debt. Bennett leaned his weight over the glass table and looked directly into the developer's terrified eyes. He explained the brutal reality of the new corporate hierarchy that had been established while Sterling was pouring coffee. He stated that Vanguard Holdings now held the exclusive legal right to call in every single penny of his corporate debt entirely on demand. We owned the high-rise building we were currently standing in. We owned his development firm. We owned his private commercial bank accounts. Bennett made it perfectly clear that if Sterling signed his name to that forged property deed, Vanguard would instantly trigger an immediate catastrophic default on all of his loans. We would completely liquidate his entire real estate empire before he even had the chance to walk out of the conference room. I watched Arthur Sterling physically shrink into his expensive leather chair. The powerful, arrogant developer who had threatened to have me thrown face first onto the pavement just moments ago was now staring at me with pure, unadulterated terror. He dropped his silver pen onto the floor as if the metal had suddenly caught fire. He pushed his heavy chair back violently away from the mahogany table, raising his hands in a frantic defensive gesture. He looked at Amanda and Cameron like they had just handed him a live grenade with the pin pulled out. He told them, his voice cracking with panic, that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with this transaction. He practically begged me to understand that he had been completely deceived and that he had absolutely no idea he was dealing with the founding director of Vanguard Holdings. Amanda stood entirely paralyzed at the head of the table. She looked at the heavy black titanium card resting on her forged documents, and then looked at the towering stack of certified debt acquisition papers. The desperate, flawless illusion she had built over the last 12 hours completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She had thought she was manipulating a senile old man who had no power left in the world. She thought she had outsmarted a retired machinist who would simply roll over and accept his fate in a locked ward. She had absolutely no idea that she had provoked a billionaire who could buy and sell the very corporate predators she feared. Cameron backed away slowly into the far corner of the glass room, clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. He realized in that suffocating moment that they were not just caught in a pathetic lie. They were physically trapped in a room with the most dangerous man in the financial district, and their violent shadow lenders were still waiting outside for $250,000 that was never going to arrive. Cameron stared at the thick stack of federal documents resting on the polished mahogany table. His breathing turned into rapid, shallow gasps that echoed loudly in the pristine glass room. He realized the certified papers represented the total annihilation of his only escape route. Panic completely overrode his basic sense of self-preservation. He let out a strange, guttural sound and lunged forward across the wide table. He threw his arms out in a pathetic attempt to physically snatch the certified acquisition files right off the wood. He moved with the blind, frantic energy of a drowning man clawing at a sinking life raft. He intended to tear the pages to shreds or simply run out of the heavy glass doors with them in his hands. He truly believed that if he destroyed the physical paper, the crushing corporate reality would simply cease to exist. He thought he could erase his monumental failure by tearing up the evidence before the developer could read it. He did not even manage to brush his fingertips against the black leather folder. Alexander Pierce moved with a sudden, fluid speed that completely belied his age and his tailored suit. He stepped effortlessly into the path of the lunging man. Alexander did not strike him or raise his voice. He simply caught the desperate man by the lapels of his expensive imported jacket and used his own frantic momentum entirely against him. Alexander pivoted slightly on his heel and shoved the younger man backward with a calculated, devastating force. The husband of my daughter stumbled wildly across the thick carpet, unable to regain his footing. He crashed hard against the far glass wall of the conference room. The heavy impact rattled the thick, transparent panels and knocked the breath completely out of his lungs. He slid down the smooth glass and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Alexander adjusted his silver cuffs and calmly stepped back into his position beside me, as if he had merely swatted away a bothersome insect. I did not even turn my head to watch the pathetic man fall to the floor. My eyes remained entirely locked on Arthur Sterling. The developer was sitting perfectly rigid in his high-backed leather chair. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked from the gasping man on the floor to the immaculate silver hair of Alexander Pierce and finally back to me. The legendary corporate scavenger was finally beginning to understand the microscopic size of his own existence in the face of true global capital. I leaned my hands flat against the mahogany table. I leaned in close to the developer, ensuring my voice carried the absolute freezing weight of a winter storm. I told him to look very closely at the certified documents resting near his hands before he made another move. I explained to Arthur Sterling the precise and inescapable architecture of his new reality. I told him that my corporate acquisition team had spent the last 3 hours entirely dismantling the financial structure of his real estate development firm. I spoke in a slow, measured tone, detailing how his massive empire was built on a fragile foundation of sand. I explained that we knew exactly how highly leveraged his luxury high-rise projects were. We knew he relied exclusively on aggressive short-term commercial loans and volatile mezzanine debt to maintain his daily operations and fund his predatory acquisitions. I told him that Vanguard Holdings had systematically purchased every single one of those commercial notes from his shadow banks before he even woke up this morning. We had bought his massive operational debt with absolute silent efficiency. I let the silence hang in the freezing air for a moment, so the absolute gravity of the situation could crush the remaining arrogance out of his chest. I explained that I now personally held the exclusive legal right to call in every single penny of his corporate debt entirely on demand. The luxurious high-rise office building we were currently standing inside no longer belonged to him. The pending construction projects he had leveraged his entire professional reputation on were now the direct property of my corporate portfolio. I told him that he was no longer an independent predator roaming the financial district looking for vulnerable victims. He was a fully owned subsidiary of my holding company. He was an employee who reported directly to the man whose property he was currently attempting to steal. Arthur Sterling swallowed hard, and his hands began to tremble on the table. I watched his throat work nervously against the tight collar of his slate gray suit. He opened his mouth to offer a pathetic corporate defense, but I did not allow him to speak a single word. I delivered the final and absolute ultimatum. I told him that my daughter was sitting at the end of his table holding a forged medical document and a fraudulent property deed. I explained that if he picked up his silver pen and accepted her forged signature, I would instantly trigger a catastrophic default on every single loan his company possessed. I promised him, with absolute chilling sincerity, that I would completely liquidate his entire real estate empire before the digital clock on the wall struck 1 in the afternoon. He would leave this building today with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and a mountain of federal litigation waiting for him. The developer stared into my eyes and saw the absolute lack of mercy waiting for him in the shadows. He was a greedy man, but he was not a suicidal one. He understood the fundamental mechanics of corporate power, and he recognized that he was entirely outmatched by a force he could not comprehend. He did not attempt to negotiate a better deal. He did not offer a false apology for his previous threats or his disgusting arrogance. He simply looked down at the forged deed resting on the table in front of him. The black ink from the dropped fountain pen had seeped deeply into the thick paper, ruining the signature line and staining the wood. Sterling raised his hands slowly, keeping them perfectly visible. He placed his palms flat against the mahogany wood and deliberately pushed the fraudulent paperwork far away from him. He slid the ruined documents directly back toward Amanda. He looked at my daughter with an expression of pure, unvarnished disgust. He stated in a voice trembling with residual fear that the real estate transaction was completely and permanently terminated. He announced that his development firm had absolutely zero interest in acquiring the suburban estate under any circumstances. He told Amanda that she had brought a fatal sickness into his office, and he ordered her to take her forged paperwork and get out of his sight immediately. Sterling then stood up slowly from his expensive leather chair. He carefully straightened his jacket and backed away from the conference table, entirely leaving the forged documents resting squarely in front of my daughter. He retreated toward the door, completely abandoning the lucrative deal to save his own miserable skin. Amanda stared down at the rejected paperwork resting on the table. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely keep them resting in her lap. The massive influx of untraceable cash she had desperately counted on to save her lifestyle was completely gone. The predatory developer, who was supposed to be her ultimate salvation, was now standing in the corner of the room, terrified of her own father. She looked up at me, and the reality of her total destruction finally pierced through her endless, towering arrogance. She realized that there was no magic check waiting to bail her out of this disaster. There was no safety net left to catch her as she fell. She was completely bankrupt, completely exposed, and entirely alone in a room with the man she had tried to bury alive. In the far corner of the room, her husband was still gasping for air against the thick glass wall. He clutched his chest and stared at the rejected deed with wide, horrified eyes. He understood that the termination of the sale meant his violent shadow creditors were going to find him before the sun went down. He had wagered his actual physical safety on the success of this fraudulent transfer, and he had lost everything. He let out a low, pathetic whimper that sounded like a dying animal trapped in a snare. They had spent 12 hours weaving a flawless trap of medical perjury and wire fraud, hoping to erase my legacy and steal my home. They had succeeded only in dragging themselves into the absolute center of an inescapable corporate slaughter. Cameron stared down at the rejected paperwork resting on the dark, polished wood. The solid black titanium card sat directly on top of the forged signatures like a heavy gravestone. Cameron was suffocating under the crushing weight of his own monumental failure. His violent shadow lenders were waiting in the streets outside the building, expecting a massive wire transfer that was never going to arrive. His mind completely fractured under the sheer pressure of his looming reality. He believed with the blind, irrational logic of a trapped animal that the physical papers on the table were his only true enemy. He thought that if he could just destroy the fraudulent deed and the fake medical documents, he could somehow erase the entire crime. He let out a strange, desperate noise deep in his throat. He threw his entire body weight forward and scrambled frantically across the polished mahogany table. He reached his shaking hands out to tear the legal documents into shreds. Alexander Pierce did not even blink. He had anticipated the frantic movements of a desperate man before Cameron had even twitched a single muscle. Alexander stepped forward with a terrifying and completely silent grace. He caught the younger man by the shoulder and the thick fabric of his expensive imported jacket. Alexander did not strike him or engage in a clumsy physical struggle. He simply applied a crushing downward pressure that utilized the younger man's own chaotic momentum entirely against him. Alexander twisted his grip slightly and shoved Cameron violently backward across the room. Cameron flew off the edge of the conference table and crashed heavily into his thick leather chair. The violent impact knocked the remaining breath completely out of his lungs. Alexander stood over him and pressed a single heavy hand flat against his chest. He pinned the younger man to the leather upholstery with absolute, effortless authority. Cameron gasped for air and tried to writhe away, but he was completely immobilized by a man twice his age. I stood perfectly still and watched the pathetic display of physical desperation. I did not move my eyes away from my daughter. Amanda was trembling so violently, her teeth were visibly chattering in her jaw. She realized her husband was completely broken and their entire conspiracy was unraveling in the center of a billionaire developer's conference room. I told Alexander that physical restraint was no longer necessary because they had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Alexander slowly removed his hand from Cameron's chest and stepped back into his position beside me. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and withdrew his encrypted mobile device. He placed the heavy black phone directly onto the center of the mahogany table. He tapped the screen twice to access the secure digital vault compiled by the Vanguard cybersecurity team. Alexander did not offer any explanation or warning to the people sitting in the room. He simply activated the media player and maximized the volume on the device. The pristine glass conference room was instantly filled with the sharp, automated tones of a municipal emergency dispatch operator connecting a call. The digital timestamp indicated the recording was captured at exactly 2:00 this morning. The operator answered the line following standard municipal protocol. A second later, the sound of Amanda weeping hysterically flooded the silent corporate boardroom. My daughter's recorded voice was pitched in a frantic, hyperventilating panic. She was begging the operator to send armed officers to my residential estate immediately. She sobbed directly into the receiver and claimed that her elderly father had suffered a total psychological collapse. She described me as violently delusional and a profound physical danger to myself and the surrounding community. She wept with perfect theatrical precision while pleading for an emergency medical extraction. Arthur Sterling stood frozen near the heavy glass doors of his own boardroom. The ruthless corporate developer listened to the audio recording, with his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. He was listening to the exact criminal origin of the fraudulent conservatorship he had almost accepted. He realized just how close he had come to participating in a massive and highly illegal kidnapping conspiracy. Amanda sat at the table and stared at the mobile device in absolute horror. She was forced to listen to her own fabricated tears and her own pathetic lies echoing off the pristine glass walls. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut and covered her ears with her shaking hands, but the volume was far too loud to escape. She had practiced that emotional performance for hours in the dark, and now it was the exact instrument of her total destruction. The emergency operator on the recording instructed Amanda to remain calm and promised her that multiple police units were already en route to my address. Amanda continued to sob loudly into the microphone, playing the role of a traumatized and terrified daughter. Then the audio suddenly shifted. Alexander tapped his screen again and activated a specialized digital filter. The Vanguard tech team had spent the early morning hours isolating the specific audio frequencies of the intercepted dispatch call. They had stripped away Amanda's loud, hysterical weeping and heavily amplified the ambient background noise occurring inside her house during the exact moment of the call. The filtered audio hissed and popped with digital static before sharpening into absolute crystalline clarity. The room listened as a second voice emerged from the shadows of the recording. It was Cameron. He was not speaking to the emergency operator. He was pacing nervously in the background of his own living room and issuing direct, calculated instructions to his wife. His voice was completely devoid of panic or grief. It was cold and utterly predatory. His enhanced words echoed through the silent developer's office with devastating precision. He told Amanda to keep crying and to make sure her voice sounded sufficiently terrified for the police recorders. He instructed her to ensure the offshore account numbers were placed clearly visible on my desk before the police officers kicked the door in. He explicitly stated that planting those fraudulent banking documents was the only way to justify freezing my corporate assets during the medical hold. The recording continued to play his damning instructions to the silent room. He reminded Amanda that the unlicensed medical transport van was already paid for and waiting 3 blocks away from my estate. He told her that once the police dragged me out of the house in handcuffs, the private mercenaries would take over and she would have full control of Vanguard Holdings by sunrise. The audio file ended with a sharp digital click, returning the conference room to a suffocating and profound silence. The recording was not a theory or a piece of circumstantial evidence. It was the undeniable raw proof of a highly premeditated criminal conspiracy. It was wire fraud, elder abuse, and attempted kidnapping captured and preserved in their own explicit words. The mobile device sitting on the mahogany table was a piece of standard Vanguard corporate hardware, but right now it was the most dangerous object in the building. It represented the total surveillance supremacy of my empire. Cameron had foolishly believed his encrypted startup network was secure. He had believed he could coordinate a massive felony from the comfort of his living room without leaving a single digital footprint. He had severely underestimated the depth of the corporate intelligence apparatus he was trying to steal. Vanguard did not simply monitor bank accounts or property deeds. Vanguard monitored the very air its enemies breathed. Amanda lowered her hands from her face and stared across the table at her husband. She had executed the phone call and shed the fake tears, but hearing Cameron direct her performance like a theater director stripped away the last of her defensive delusions. They were not two desperate people trying to survive a financial crisis. They were calculating predators who had eagerly plotted to erase a human life. The recording laid bare the absolute rot at the core of their marriage. Cameron had used her to commit the actual felony over the phone while he stood safely in the background, issuing orders. If the police had ever investigated the initial call, Amanda would have been the primary target of the perjury charges. Cameron had positioned his own wife as the sacrificial lamb in his scheme to steal my wealth. Arthur Sterling stepped even further back toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The developer had spent his entire career operating in the morally gray margins of real estate law, but he never crossed the line into violent felonies. Kidnapping and wire fraud brought the kind of federal scrutiny that could completely vaporize a holding company overnight. Sterling looked at me with a newfound and profound reverence. He understood now why I had initiated the hostile takeover of his commercial debt. I was not simply protecting a piece of suburban real estate. I was systematically locking every single door in the city so these two criminals could not escape the slaughter. Sterling placed his hands flat against the glass door behind him, silently signaling his complete surrender and his absolute disavowal of the two people sitting at his table. Cameron sat entirely paralyzed in his leather chair. His face was slick with cold sweat, and his eyes were completely vacant. He had just listened to himself orchestrating a federal crime on a recorded municipal emergency line. He knew that Vanguard Holdings possessed the absolute capability to hand that pristine audio file directly to the federal authorities. He knew that the unedited dispatch tape carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence that would outlast the remainder of his natural life. He did not attempt to stand up again. He did not look at the developer or at his wife. He simply stared at the blank screen of the mobile device on the table as the crushing weight of his absolute ruin finally broke his spine. The silence in the room was heavier than the titanium card resting on the table. The unbroken chain of conflict had led exactly to this frozen moment in time. There was no remaining legal maneuver for Bennett to execute. There was no physical threat left for Alexander to neutralize. The audio recording had done the work of 1,000 lawyers and 100 corporate security guards. It had stripped away every lie, every justification, and every shred of their false dignity. They were cornered rats waiting for the trap to snap shut on their necks. The heavy silence in the pristine glass boardroom was finally broken by the sound of my daughter gasping for air. Amanda stared at the black mobile device resting on the mahogany table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She realized with absolute terrifying clarity that her entire carefully constructed reality had completely evaporated. There was no massive inheritance waiting for her. There was no liquid cash to salvage her failing marriage or pay off her mounting debts. There was only the digital echo of her own voice committing a massive federal felony in real time. She looked at me and saw absolutely zero mercy in my eyes. Then she turned her head and looked at her husband shivering in the far corner of the room. I watched the exact moment Amanda decided to completely abandon the man she had promised to love and protect. She was a cornered animal, recognizing that her only remaining path to survival required a brutal blood sacrifice. She took a deep, trembling breath and immediately began to construct an entirely new narrative to save her own skin. Amanda pointed a shaking finger at Cameron and began to sob heavily. She told me that she was a desperate victim of severe domestic coercion. She claimed that Cameron had systematically isolated her from our family and completely taken over her personal finances. She wept loudly and insisted that her husband had violently forced her to make that emergency dispatch call against her own free will. She told the silent boardroom that she had absolutely no idea what offshore accounts were or how corporate wire transfers operated. She begged me to believe that she was merely a terrified pawn in his predatory scheme. She promised to testify against him in any court of law if I would just forgive her and protect her from the authorities. Cameron stared at his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The man who had confidently orchestrated my physical extraction just hours ago was now watching his own partner offer him up to the slaughter. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was drowning in a sea of absolute betrayal. They had spent months weaving a flawless web of deception together, and at the very first sign of genuine corporate retaliation, she was stepping on his throat to keep her own head above water. I did not move a single muscle to comfort my daughter. I looked down at her tear-stained face and felt an overwhelming sense of profound emptiness. I told Amanda that her theatrical performance was entirely useless and completely insulting to my intelligence. I reminded her with freezing precision that we had intercepted every single digital transmission from her personal devices. I stated that she had personally negotiated the cash premium with the unlicensed medical transport team. She had explicitly authorized the use of physical force against her own father. I told her that she was not a fragile victim of manipulation. She was a calculating predator who had simply lost the game, and now she had to pay the ultimate price. Before Amanda could formulate another pathetic lie, a faint sound began to penetrate the thick, soundproof glass of the executive conference room. It started as a distant wail echoing through the deep concrete canyons of the financial district. The sound rapidly multiplied and grew exponentially louder until the shrill screaming of heavy sirens surrounded the entire high-rise building. Red and blue emergency lights began to flash against the neighboring glass skyscrapers, casting chaotic shadows across the polished mahogany table. Cameron flinched violently against the glass wall. His eyes darted toward the floor-to-ceiling windows in absolute panic. He believed his violent shadow lenders had finally arrived to collect their $250,000. He thought the local police were surrounding the building to drag me back to the psychiatric ward. He was entirely consumed by the blinding terror of a man who knew his time had completely run out, and there was nowhere left to run. Arthur Sterling remained perfectly frozen near the doorway. The ruthless developer did not say a word as the heavy glass doors of his private boardroom swung open for the second time that morning. Two men wearing dark conservative suits and severe expressions walked into the room. They did not move with the frantic, chaotic energy of local police officers responding to an emergency call. They moved with the cold, methodical authority of federal investigators executing a highly coordinated strike. They carried heavy leather binders and wore official identification lanyards clipped to their breast pockets. Bennett Reed stepped forward and greeted the lead investigator with a brief professional nod. Bennett did not need to offer any lengthy explanations or dramatic speeches. He simply picked up his black folder and handed a thick stack of printed network diagnostics directly to the federal agent. Bennett explained to the quiet room that the corporate security team belonging to Vanguard had not merely recorded the phone calls. They had executed a total digital forensic audit of the tech startup belonging to Cameron. Bennett stated that his cyber team had tracked and verified the exact routing protocols Cameron used during the early morning hours. They had isolated the specific digital footprints, establishing that Cameron had utilized stolen corporate credentials to attempt a massive, unauthorized transfer of Vanguard capital. Bennett had packaged the raw data, the intercepted communications, and the verified financial routing numbers and forwarded them directly to the Federal Cybercrime Division hours ago. The lead federal agent accepted the documents and turned his cold, absolute attention entirely onto Cameron. The agent did not raise his voice or attempt to intimidate the broken man cowering against the glass. He spoke with the terrifying routine precision of a man reading a permanent death sentence. The agent informed Cameron that he was officially under investigation for executing unauthorized wire fraud across international borders. He detailed the exact statutes regarding the exploitation of stolen corporate infrastructure and the premeditated extortion of a federal entity. The agent stated with absolute crystal clarity that manipulating financial networks to funnel stolen capital into offshore accounts was not a minor civil dispute. It was a severe federal offense that carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence. Cameron felt his legs completely give out beneath him. He slid down the glass wall and hit the floor with a pathetic thud. He realized he was not going to face a local judge who could be bribed or a civil court that could be tied up in endless litigation. He was going directly into the brutal and inescapable machinery of the federal justice system. He knew that the mandatory minimum sentence meant he would spend the most productive decades of his natural life locked inside a concrete cell, completely isolated and entirely unprotected. 2 additional uniformed officers entered the boardroom, carrying heavy steel handcuffs. They walked directly over to the corner of the room and hauled Cameron roughly to his feet. He did not fight them. He did not scream or protest his innocence. He was entirely hollowed out by the crushing weight of his monumental failure. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed loudly in the silent room. It was the absolute final sound of his destroyed ambition. I watched the federal agents read Cameron his rights, and I felt an absolute stillness settle over my mind. For 30 years, I had built Vanguard Holdings into a global titan by identifying vulnerabilities and excising them with extreme prejudice. I had applied that exact same ruthless corporate strategy to my own family. I had given Amanda every possible opportunity to walk away from this disaster, but she had chosen to double down on her betrayal. She had aligned herself with a weak, desperate man, and she had allowed his financial failures to poison her own morality. Now they were both being completely dismantled by the very corporate machine they had tried to steal. The lead federal agent turned his attention from the hallway back to the conference table. He opened the thick leather binder provided by Bennett and began to read the specific offshore account numbers allowed to the room. The agent confirmed that the routing numbers matched a known laundering syndicate operating out of the Cayman Islands. He explained that transferring funds to this specific syndicate immediately triggered a secondary federal charge of international money laundering. Cameron had not just tried to steal a fortune. He had wired that fortune directly into a dark network currently under active federal investigation. By trying to hide his stolen cash, he had essentially handed the federal authorities a perfect map to his own destruction. Arthur Sterling watched the federal agents march the ruined man out of his private office. The developer pressed his back firmly against the wall, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the catastrophic fallout. He had survived his entire career by knowing exactly when to walk away from a toxic asset, and he knew Vanguard Holdings was currently exterminating a massive infection. Amanda sat alone at the massive mahogany table. She watched the federal agents drag her husband through the glass doors and down the polished marble hallway. The terrifying reality of the mandatory federal sentence hung in the air like thick black smoke. She tried to stand up from her leather chair, but her knees buckled and she collapsed back into the seat. She looked at Bennett and begged him to explain the situation to the federal agents. She pleaded with the corporate attorney to show them the text messages, proving she was only following orders. Bennett did not even acknowledge her existence. He simply closed his empty black folder and stood silently behind my right shoulder, waiting for my final directive. She slowly turned her head and looked up at my face. She was completely trapped. She had forged my medical records. She had authorized an illegal kidnapping. She had actively participated in the extortion conspiracy. She realized in that freezing moment that the federal agents were not just here for Cameron. She had built her own prison cell, and the heavy steel door was about to slam shut forever. I looked down at the forged property deed still resting on the table beneath my solid black titanium card. The ink had completely dried into a permanent ugly stain. The estate where I had raised my daughter was safe. The legacy I had built from nothing was completely secure. I reached down and picked up the titanium card, slipping it back into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I looked at the lead federal agent and gave him a single sharp nod. The agent turned toward Amanda and pulled a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around Amanda's wrists with a sharp and final click. It was a completely ordinary sound, but in the pristine acoustics of the glass conference room, it echoed like the slamming of a heavy iron vault. The lead federal agent secured the locking mechanism without displaying a single ounce of emotion or sympathy. Amanda stumbled forward slightly as her arms were pulled behind her back. She looked down at the cold metal biting into her skin, and the absolute reality of federal prison finally crashed down upon her shoulders. There would be no high-priced corporate defense lawyers swooping in to save her. There would be no quiet settlements or sealed court records. She was going to be processed, fingerprinted, and locked inside a concrete cell for a very long time. She turned her head slowly and looked across the polished mahogany table at her husband. Cameron was still slumped against the far glass wall, with his own wrists securely bound in heavy steel. He was breathing in ragged, desperate gasps as he stared at the federal agents. The survival instinct is a brutal and uncompromising force. It strips away every layer of human decency and every vow of marital loyalty in a fraction of a second. Cameron looked at his wife and he did not see a partner. He saw a sinking ship, and he was completely determined to cut the anchor before she dragged him down to the bottom of the ocean. He scrambled awkwardly onto his knees and pushed himself up against the thick glass panel. He ignored me completely and focused his terrified eyes entirely on the lead federal agent holding the leather binder. Cameron began to speak with a frantic, breathless urgency. He pointed his bound hands directly at Amanda and declared that he was completely innocent of the core conspiracy. He swore to the federal agents that the entire medical extortion plot was engineered entirely by his wife. He claimed that he was nothing more than a manipulated spouse who had been dragged blindly into her malicious scheme. He told the agents that Amanda had been obsessed with her future inheritance for years. He stated that she was deeply resentful of my continued health and completely terrified that I would eventually leave the Vanguard Empire to a charitable foundation. He threw all the weight of the premeditated crime directly onto her shoulders, claiming that she had spent months secretly researching municipal psychiatric hold laws and state conservatorship loopholes in the dead of night. Amanda recoiled as if she had been physically struck across the face. The last remaining illusion of their loving marriage instantly and completely burned to ash right in front of my eyes. She stared at the man she had promised to love and protect, and her shock rapidly twisted into a venomous, unadulterated rage. She did not attempt to maintain her composure or defend her innocence to the authorities. She went entirely on the offensive. Amanda shrieked across the boardroom, telling the federal agents that her husband was a desperate, pathetic liar who was trying to save his own miserable skin. She screamed that Cameron had forced her into executing the plan because his tech startup was a complete and total catastrophic failure. She did not stop there. Amanda completely shattered the wall of silence surrounding his financial ruin. She told the agents that Cameron had borrowed massive amounts of unauthorized capital from violent shadow lenders to keep his fraudulent company afloat. She revealed that those dangerous creditors had found out about his insolvency and had explicitly threatened their lives and their property. She claimed that Cameron was practically paralyzed with fear and that he was the one who demanded they target my estate to pay off his illicit debts. She detailed how he had bullied and threatened her into forging the medical documents claiming he would abandon her to the loan sharks if she refused to comply. She portrayed herself as a terrified hostage operating under extreme physical and psychological duress. Cameron let out a loud, furious shout and violently rejected her narrative. He refused to let her paint herself as a victim. He immediately retaliated by exposing the deepest and most secure layers of their digital conspiracy. He told the federal investigators that Amanda was the one who established the offshore routing numbers. He provided the agents with the exact name of the shell corporation she had secretly registered in the Cayman Islands, using her maiden name and a fabricated residential address. He detailed the precise timeline of her actions, explaining that she had personally visited a corrupt notary to finalize the fraudulent power of attorney paperwork while he was asleep. He was systematically dismantling every single lie she had ever told, stripping away her deniability, and handing the federal authorities a perfectly structured roadmap to her financial crimes. Amanda shrieked over his voice, refusing to let him control the narrative. She countered his financial revelations by exposing his cybercrimes. She told the agents to audit the server logs at his tech startup. She explained with vicious clarity that Cameron had utilized his own corporate infrastructure to digitally mask their internet routing protocols and bypass the Vanguard security firewalls. She revealed that he had spent weeks attempting to steal my personal access codes and that he had personally routed the payment to the unlicensed medical transport team using a heavily encrypted dark web portal. She explicitly told the authorities that Cameron had hired the mercenaries and given them the direct order to use physical force during my extraction. They were caught in a vicious downward spiral of mutual destruction, voluntarily confessing to a sprawling network of federal felonies simply out of pure spite. The two federal agents did not interrupt the screaming couple. They did not need to interrogate them or offer them reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. The lead agent simply reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small digital audio recorder on the mahogany table. He pressed a single button and allowed the device to capture every single word of their frantic, chaotic confessions. They were doing the work of the federal prosecutors for them. They were happily providing times, dates, locations, and specific criminal methodologies in their desperate attempt to tear each other apart. They were entirely blinded by their mutual hatred and their profound terror, completely failing to realize that every accusation they hurled at one another was only cementing their shared mandatory prison sentence. I stood silently beside Alexander and watched my daughter destroy the man she had chosen to marry. It was a cold and deeply unnatural thing to witness. I realized that there had never been any genuine love or respect between them. Their entire relationship was nothing more than a parasitic transaction built on a fragile foundation of mutual greed and unchecked arrogance. When the money vanished and the power evaporated, they instantly turned into rabid animals trapped in a cage together. I thought about the millions of dollars I had spent securing their lavish wedding and purchasing their first home. I thought about the endless financial bailouts I had provided to keep their polished suburban illusion intact. I had financed the very arrogance that led them to this boardroom, and now I was watching the federal government permanently collect the debt. The furious screaming match eventually ran out of oxygen. Amanda and Cameron had completely exhausted their arsenal of hidden secrets. They had exposed every forged signature, every offshore account, and every illicit payoff. They were left panting and sweating in their respective corners of the room, staring at each other with absolute unmasked revulsion. The lead federal agent picked up his digital recorder and slipped it back into his pocket. He signaled to the uniformed officers waiting in the hallway. The heavy glass doors swung open, and the officers marched into the room to physically remove the suspects. Amanda did not look back at me as the officers pulled her toward the doorway. She kept her head down, entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of her failure. Cameron stumbled forward on trembling legs, his face completely pale and his eyes fixed blindly on the floor. They were escorted out of the pristine corporate boardroom and led down the long marble corridor toward the freight elevators. Arthur Sterling remained pressed against the far wall, watching the entire sequence of events in absolute mute horror. The ruthless developer had witnessed a masterclass in corporate annihilation, and he knew exactly how close he had come to wearing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs himself. The room fell into a deep and heavy silence, leaving only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the dark ink stain on the mahogany table as the final remaining evidence that they had ever been there at all. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted around Amanda's wrists. The sharp metallic clicks cut through the dead air of the pristine glass conference room. She stumbled awkwardly as the federal agent pulled her arms firmly behind her back. The tailored fabric of her expensive designer dress wrinkled and twisted under the rigid physical restraint. She was no longer a polished corporate executive or a grieving daughter playing a theatrical role. She was a cornered criminal facing the absolute terrifying reality of federal prison. Cameron was already being dragged out into the marble hallway by two uniformed officers, his head hanging low in total pathetic defeat. Amanda dug the heels of her shoes into the thick carpet, fighting the forward momentum of the federal agent. She whipped her head around and locked her wide, terrified eyes directly onto my face. The absolute panic radiating from her was completely suffocating. She opened her mouth and began to beg. Her voice cracked and broke as she desperately pleaded with me to stop the federal agents from taking her away. She begged me to use the limitless corporate power of Vanguard Holdings to intervene on her behalf. She cried out that I had an entire army of the most ruthless defense attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard sitting on my payroll. She pleaded with me to make a few quiet phone calls to pay whatever massive fines were necessary to completely bury the federal wire fraud charges. She tried to invoke the sacred memory of her mother, weeping loudly, as she claimed she was my only child and my only remaining family. She asked me to remember the little girl I had raised and to look past the terrible, desperate mistakes she had made under the crushing pressure of her failing marriage. She desperately wanted the invisible safety net to materialize just one last time. She wanted me to shield her from the brutal machinery of the federal justice system, just as I had shielded her from every other minor inconvenience in her entire life. I stood perfectly still and watched the heavy tears stream down her pale face. I did not feel a single ounce of sadistic joy or vindictive triumph. There was absolutely no warmth of victory expanding in my chest. There was only the cold, hollow sensation of a trauma surgeon looking down at a gangrenous limb that had to be brutally severed to save the rest of the body. I kept my voice entirely level and completely devoid of any elevated emotion. I told Amanda that for 40 years I had broken my back and sacrificed my own peace of mind to build an impenetrable fortress around her. I had constructed Vanguard Holdings from nothing specifically to ensure she would never know the bitter taste of poverty or genuine desperation. I had given her a magnificent foundation of absolute financial security so she could build a life of honor, integrity, and purpose. I explained to my daughter that she had taken that magnificent foundation and deliberately poisoned the well. I told her that she had looked at a lifetime of my silent, unconditional sacrifice and saw only a pathetic weakness waiting to be exploited. She had not come to me for honest help when the shadow lenders threatened her lavish lifestyle. Instead, She had eagerly chosen to forge medical documents, lie to a federal judge, and hire unlicensed mercenaries to physically erase me from the earth. I told her that true family was an unbreakable alliance forged in mutual respect and absolute loyalty. She had completely shattered that alliance the second she paid those men to drag me out of my own home in the middle of the night. I stated with absolute chilling finality that I was not going to deploy a single corporate attorney to save her. I was not going to spend a single penny of Vanguard capital to interfere with the federal investigation. She was going to face the absolute and terrifying consequences of her own choices entirely alone. The federal agent gave her shoulder a firm pull and marched her forcefully toward the heavy glass doors. Amanda let out a broken, sobbing wail that echoed terribly down the polished marble corridor, but I did not turn my head to watch her leave. I looked directly at Bennett Reed. The corporate attorney stood at absolute attention, holding his black leather briefcase tightly against his side. I instructed him to immediately file the necessary legal injunctions to permanently incinerate the fraudulent conservatorship. I ordered him to contact the presiding state judge and provide the unedited emergency dispatch recording, along with the federal wire fraud indictment. The false medical hold would be completely dissolved before the afternoon was over. I did not stop at simply restoring my legal autonomy. I looked Bennett directly in the eyes and commanded him to entirely rewrite my last will and testament immediately. I instructed him to completely and permanently sever all biological ties to my estate. Amanda was to be entirely disinherited from Vanguard Holdings, from the liquid corporate assets, and from all residential properties. I ordered that the entirety of my accumulated wealth be legally redirected into an impenetrable charitable trust dedicated exclusively to protecting elderly individuals from severe financial abuse and family exploitation. I wanted every single legal avenue completely sealed off. I wanted to ensure that even 100 years after my death, my daughter would never be able to access a single cent of the empire I had built. Bennett gave a single sharp nod of absolute understanding. The legal severance was total, absolute, and unapologetic. Arthur Sterling was still standing perfectly rigid in the far corner of his own boardroom. The ruthless developer looked like a man who had just survived a devastating natural disaster. He had witnessed the total destruction of a family and the terrifying deployment of raw, unrestricted corporate authority. I did not offer him a parting word or a polite handshake. I simply turned my back on him and walked out of the glass conference room. Alexander Pierce fell into step on my right side, and Bennett Reed flanked my left. We marched down the long corridor in complete synchronization, leaving the developer alone with his crippled empire and his suffocating debt. We stepped into the private elevator and rode down to the subterranean parking garage in absolute silence. The war was officially over. The armored town car carried us away from the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district and back toward the quiet tree-lined streets of the suburbs. I watched the city blur past the tinted windows, feeling the heavy adrenaline slowly begin to drain from my veins. The transition from the violent corporate battlefield to the peaceful residential avenues felt profoundly surreal. We pulled through the wrought iron gates of my estate, and the heavy tires crunched softly against the long gravel driveway. The massive stone house stood exactly where it always had, but the atmosphere surrounding it had fundamentally and permanently shifted. The town car rolled to a gentle stop near the front portico. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The front entrance of my home was currently a hive of quiet, highly efficient activity. A specialized physical security crew deployed directly from Vanguard Holdings was already on site. 4 men in dark, unmarked uniforms were carefully removing the shattered remnants of the heavy oak front door that the corrupt police officers had violently kicked in at 2 a.m. They operated with absolute silent precision, installing a massive reinforced steel frame and a state-of-the-art biometric locking mechanism. The physical breach of my sanctuary was being permanently repaired and heavily fortified by the very corporate power my daughter had foolishly tried to steal. I walked past the diligent security team and stepped over the threshold into the grand foyer. Alexander and Bennett remained outside, quietly coordinating with the vanguard crew to ensure the perimeter was completely locked down. I stood alone in the center of the large entryway. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the high arched windows, casting long, warm shadow swathes across the polished, hardwood floors. I slowly walked through the quiet, empty rooms of the estate. I passed the formal dining room where we had shared countless tense holiday meals, and I walked into my private study, where the forged banking documents had been maliciously planted upon my desk. The false papers were gone now, entirely collected as hard evidence by the Federal Cybercrime Division. I sat down heavily in the worn leather chair behind my desk. I rested my hands flat against the cool, smooth wood and let out a long, slow breath. For years, this sprawling, empty house had felt like a magnificent tomb. The silence that filled these rooms used to carry the suffocating, crushing weight of endured disrespect. It used to be a heavy, bitter silence born from watching my only child look at me with calculating, predatory eyes. I had spent years quietly absorbing her veiled insults and bailing out her endless failures, hoping that my silent sacrifice would eventually earn her genuine love. That toxic draining cycle was completely broken now. I listened to the faint, distant sounds of the Vanguard security crew finishing their work on the front entrance. The air inside the study felt profoundly different. The oppressive, heavy tension that had haunted my chest for 5 long years was completely gone. The silence in my house was no longer a terrible burden to be carried. It was the absolute unyielding peace of a man who had finally stopped apologizing for his own survival. I had not destroyed my bloodline out of malice or spite. I had simply forced the arrogant predators to face the brutal reality of their own actions. I had stepped out of the shadows, wielded the absolute truth like a scalpel, and surgically removed the infection from my life. The natural order of the world had been violently and permanently restored. I leaned back into the deep leather cushions, closed my eyes, and for the first time in an eternity, I felt completely and entirely at home. The profound lesson learned from this ordeal is that blood relations do not automatically guarantee loyalty or grant a permanent license for disrespect. True family is an alliance built on mutual respect and unwavering integrity rather than a blind obligation to endure endless exploitation. When the people we sacrifice our entire lives to protect choose to view our generosity as a weakness to be preyed upon, we must find the absolute courage to sever those ties completely. Tolerating abuse in the name of familial duty only poisons our own existence and empowers the predators hiding in our homes. We must learn to firmly protect our dignity and recognize that walking away from a toxic bloodline is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary step toward reclaiming our own fundamental peace. Please share your thoughts on this story and subscribe to our channel to hear more powerful narratives about reclaiming personal dignity and justice.